my name is Sophie and I'm a violinist with the OAE. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a feature of music called the clef. There are a number of different types of clef, and you might have seen one of them at the beginning of a piece of music. These 5 lines are known as the stave. Before the stave and clef were developed as we know them today, singers in the medieval era used words with symbols above them known as neumes. These showed the shape of the music, but they were limited because they didn't show the exact pitch or rhythm, so they were only useful if you already knew the tune. So as music developed, they needed a new, more precise system of notating pitch. In around the year 1030, Guido of Arezzo, who was a Benedictine monk and music theorist in the 11th century, came up with the idea of a musical stave to indicate precisely how high or low a note was compared to the notes around it.
The notes are so arranged then that each sound, however often it may be repeated in a melody, is found always in its own row. And in order that you may better distinguish these rows, lines are drawn close together. All the sounds on one line or in one space sound alike. And in order that you may understand to which lines or spaces each sound belongs, certain letters are written at the beginning of lines or spaces.
In Guido's original system, any letter between A and G could be used as a clef sign by placing it at the beginning of the music in either a line or a space. The notes F and C became singled out by colouring the lines on the stave as yellow and red respectively. These letters were chosen because they are the 2 places in the scale with a semitone just below them, and because they tended to be anchor notes in chant notation. F and C are also the notes on a modern harp that have coloured strings, black for F and red for C. Eventually, the function of the F and C coloured lines was combined with the letter notations of clefs. The G clef wasn't standardised until later, but there's no obvious reason for why it became chosen. Until the mid-18th century, the F and C clefs were still the most standard ones. G clefs were only really used for certain high-pitched instruments like violins or flutes and were rarely used in vocal or keyboard music. The letters F, C and G have been embellished and evolved into the clef symbols we know today. Each clef can be placed at a number of different points on the stave, and some of these positions have been given particular names, such as the treble clef, alto clef, tenor and bass. In general, the G clef represents the higher instruments, the C clef is for middle pitched instruments, and the F clef is usually used for lower pitched instruments. You may have heard of middle C. If we bring the treble clef together with the bass clef, we can see how they relate to each other. Middle C gets its name because it runs on a line exactly in the middle of the 2 staves. The higher lines denote higher pitches and the lower lines represent the lower notes. It is possible to play notes higher or lower than the stave by adding ledger lines, a little line that runs through, above or below the individual note, such as with middle C. The G clef usually signifies what we call G4, or in other words, a G a fifth above middle C. Its usual position is on the 2nd line from the bottom, and this is called the treble clef. Many instruments use the treble clef, including the violin, flute, oboe, trumpet, and many more. Let's see what happens if we move the treble clef down by 1 line. How does this affect the pitch of the lines on the stave? This is known as the French violin clef, and the lowest line of the stave now represents G4. Here is an excerpt of music by François Couperin, in which the violin part is written in the French violin clef. Now let's take a look at the F clef. In its usual positioning, it's known as the bass clef, showing F3, or in other words, the F just below middle C. This is used by the cello, bassoon and trombone, for example. If we move the bass clef down by one line, the middle line becomes the F, and this is known as the baritone clef. If we move it up a line instead, the top line becomes F, and we have scope to show even lower notes on the stave. Hence, this one is now called the sub-bass clef. The baritone and sub-bass clefs are pretty rare now, though the baritone clef used to be used by some composers in the 17th century as the left hand for keyboard music, especially in France. Have a listen to this excerpt on the harpsichord by French composer Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, which uses the baritone clef for the left hand. The C clef is most commonly known as either the alto clef or the tenor clef. In the alto clef, the middle line of the stave is middle C, and in the tenor clef, middle C is the second line down from the top. The most frequent user of the alto clef is the viola, sandwiched in the middle register between high violins and the low cellos and basses. The tenor clef is usually used by bass instruments in their higher register, for example the bassoon, cello and trombone. Ironically, the tenor viol, which you might expect to use the tenor clef, actually uses the alto clef. The C baritone clef, which is equivalent to the F baritone clef we saw earlier, is even less common than its counterpart. Some instruments use more than one clef, such as the cello, which can play low and high notes. Usually the cello uses the bass clef, but so that cellists don't have to read lots of tiny ledger lines when they're playing high notes, composers sometimes switch to the tenor clef, which recalibrates the lines of a stave to represent higher pitches. Here's an example of a piece of music where the composer has written in two clefs. Here's how it would look if it were written all in bass clef, and here's how it looks when the composer changes to the tenor clef. It's much more neatly laid out on the page and easier to read. Also known as the rhythm clef, the neutral clef is used for untuned percussion. It can include a stave of anywhere between 1 and 5 lines. The composer is able to clearly notate rhythm, but the clef doesn't allow for pitch to be indicated. If multiple lines are used for the stave, then the placing of the note head indicates use of different instruments, enabling a percussion player to play multiple instruments while reading only one line of music. There are also some percussion instruments that can produce multiple sounds, perceived as having higher or lower pitches, but without specific frequencies, so the stave can be used to indicate the different sounds made by one instrument. Octave symbols can be used to show a change in octave from the written pitch, either up or down, to avoid having to use many ledger lines. This is particularly common in the tenor line of vocal music, which uses the G clef or treble clef, but the actual sound produced by the singer is 1 octave below that of the notated pitch. Over the last 1,000 years, since Guido of Arezzo revolutionised music theory, clefs and staves have evolved and adapted to fit the requirements of the music and the musicians. I wonder how we'll be reading music in another 1,000 years.